The United States of America was formed during the 1770s out of 13 of the British colonies. Being formerly British, the Americans primarily spoke English as their mother tongue, and to this day English is the primary language of the U.S. But English was not the only language historically spoken in this country. Obviously, there are myriad languages spoken by the American Indians, and while those are fascinating in their own right, they're not the focus of today's video. Instead, I want to talk about the minority Old World languages of America. We'll start with a language more associated with Canada than the US, that being Acadian French. Acadia was the name for the French colonial territory located in modern New England and the maritime provinces of Canada. A rather large number of Francophones settled in this region, at one time being the majority of the population. But the British took it over and began to settle their own people there, deporting large numbers of Acadians to the other former French colony in Louisiana. The Acadians were never totally removed, however, and to this day some people in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and notably for our purposes, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont still speak French. The French spoken in the States also has some Quebecois French mixed in, mostly due to Quebecers migrating south during the 1800s. This influence is absent in the Acadian dialect in Canada, making Acadian French in New England a distinct subdialect, but it's usually considered to be a part of Acadian French. Acadian French is generally more archaic than French in the Old World, and retains many features that are no longer present in Metropolitan French. This is similar to other dialects of French spoken in North America, and it's a trend seen in most scenarios, where a group of migrants or colonists move into a faraway region, bringing the language of their mother country. When this happens, their dialect changes less than the language spoken in their original homeland. During the 20th century, bilingualism was heavily shunned in the region, and schools were required to teach only in English, with students sometimes being punished for using French. Thus, most people of Acadian heritage in the States don't actually speak French anymore. Despite revival efforts, the dialect remains very endangered within the U.S., and it will likely die out eventually. New England is not the only place where native French speakers dwell in America. Earlier I mentioned how many French Canadians were expelled by the British and resettled in Louisiana, then a Spanish colonial possession. As you probably already know, these people make up the bulk of the ancestors of the Cajuns. Cajun French, just like Acadian French, is more archaic than Metropolitan French, but it has many more loan words than Acadian does, mostly from English. But there are also a few Native American words as well. There is also a tongue spoken in the region called Louisiana Creole. A Creole was a mixed language, which usually arises when people who speak different languages are forced to communicate. Louisiana Creole was created by slaves in Louisiana when they had to learn French. Some Creole languages are very unique from the languages they come from, but Louisiana Creole is very similar to French, to a point that it is often considered a dialect of French, or even a subdialect of Cajun French, rather than a language unto itself. Cajun French follows a similar history to Acadian French. It was once ubiquitous in the region, but due to Anglophone migration, it steadily declined throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was banned in schools, and by the 1950s, most Cajuns spoke English. There has been a big embrace of Louisiana's Francophone heritage in more recent times, so Cajun French will likely survive for the foreseeable future, at least in some capacity. But the Cajuns and Acadians are not the only French speakers in Canada. And the last Francophone community we'll be talking about in this video is definitely the least famous of these three. This is Missouri French, also called Illinois Country French or Paw Paw French, and was once spoken in Missouri and Illinois along the Mississippi River. This area had been part of New France in the 1600s and 1700s, but French settlement was limited to some forts and independent traders, trappers, and frontiersmen, who came south from Canada on their own initiative. As such, French colonists lived in mostly small trading towns and very small villages which lived off of farming and mining. After the 7 Years' War, all of New France went to Britain, and by the early 1800s, this area became part of the United States. Very soon, the sparse French settlements were overwhelmed by a flood of Anglophone settlers from the East Coast. French disappeared in most places, but managed to hold on for a while in select areas of Missouri. By the early 20th century, Missouri French had only a few hundred native speakers left, and despite repeated revival attempts, by 2015, there was estimated to be less than a dozen native speakers of Missouri French left. Unfortunately, the dialect is very likely to go extinct as a mother tongue soon. The next language we're going to talk about is New Mexican Spanish, once spoken in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. This region had been part of New Spain, and many Spanish speakers migrated there during the colonial period, with the first concerted effort to settle the area coming in 1598, and with the population growing more after the Pueblo Revolt a century later. New Mexican Spanish had some limited contact with what is now northern Mexico, but were largely isolated from all other Europeans. It thus remained distinct from Mexican Spanish developing to the south, and it also picked up many loanwords from the American Indians, with whom they had far more contact than their fellow colonists in Mexico. As should be familiar by now, Anglophone settlers poured into the region in the 19th and 20th centuries, and soon Spanish was in rapid decline. It was removed from street signs and newspapers and was banned in schools. Unfortunately, as of 2023, there are very few native speakers, and most of those who spoke this dialect have slowly switched to a dialect much closer to Mexican Spanish, brought into New Mexico by more recent immigrants. Soon, New Mexican Spanish may be a thing of the past. French and Spanish aren't the only old colonial languages absorbed into Anglophone America. This next language is a traditional language of New York, New Jersey, and much of the mid-Atlantic, Jersey Dutch. Jersey Dutch was a dialect of Dutch brought over by colonists who settled what was then called New Netherlands, with its capital being located in New Amsterdam. The colony had a sizable population of Dutch settlers as well as some African slaves and pacified Indians, with said Indians even developing something of a Creole language based off the language of the colonists, called Mohawk Dutch. In 1665, as part of the Second Anglo-Dutch War, the British seized the colony, integrating it into British North America and turning New Amsterdam into New York. Jersey Dutch was still spoken, however, and it would continue to be spoken throughout the colonial period and well into independence. 8th President Martin Van Buren actually spoke Jersey Dutch as his native language, and the term Yankee is thought to be derived from Jan Kees, which was a stereotypical name for Dutch people in New York and New Jersey. Like most of the languages in this video, Jersey Dutch began to be gradually and then quickly replaced by English, and today it's considered extinct. But there is still a language in the northeast US called Dutch, Pennsylvania Dutch. However, in this instance, Dutch is a misnomer, and is actually an English corruption of Deutsch, which means German. The Pennsylvania Dutch are an ethnic group made up primarily of the Amish, Mennonites, and some other German groups residing in the northeast United States. These groups, alongside a large number of German immigrants, came to Pennsylvania, and soon German was very commonly spoken in the region. In what should be a familiar story by this point, Pennsylvania Dutch began to be rapidly replaced by English, with much of the mainstream use of this language fizzling out by the early 20th century. But unlike Jersey Dutch or Paw Paw French, it never died out completely and is still spoken by over 300,000 people today. This is largely thanks to the Amish and the Mennonites. Because these religious groups are somewhat insulated from the outside world, they have been better able to retain their culture and language as compared to other linguistic minorities. Even now, children born into communities which speak Pennsylvania Dutch almost always are raised speaking it as their mother tongue. Seeing as American society is less harsh on minority languages today as it once was, it seems that Pennsylvania Dutch is here to stay. However, the same cannot be said for another group of German speakers on the other side of the Mason-Dixon line. Of course, I'm talking about Texas German. During the mid-19th century, waves of German immigrants began to travel to the United States in very large numbers. Most of these Germans settled in the Midwest or the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains, but some headed south, winding up in Texas. There, in the hill country of East Texas, a large community of Germans gathered, and soon their numbers were growing steadily. German was even recognized as co-official with English and Spanish, meaning it was actively taught in some Texan schools. In fact, Texas wasn't the only place where German was commonplace. All over the Midwest and Western United States, German newspapers, German schools, and German-speaking churches were widespread. In the early 20th century, this all changed. During World War I and again in World War II, anti-German sentiment spread throughout the U.S., and Germans faced harassment and discrimination everywhere they went. Most states banned the use of German in school classrooms, and those German newspapers and churches, though not explicitly banned, were forced through harassment and ostracism to change to English. Even sauerkraut had its name temporarily changed to Liberty Cabbage, and many Germans adopted anglicized names. Over a period of 30 years, America became thoroughly de-Germanized, with the hill country of Texas being one of the only holdouts. Texas German never truly died, or at least it hasn't yet, but it has slowly atrophied over the last century. As of 1972, there were 70,000 native speakers, and that number only rose to around 80,000 German speakers in the year 2000. That number includes European immigrants who speak German, however. So the true number of specifically Texas Germans has likely declined, Unlike Pennsylvania Dutch, it seems that Texas German will eventually die out. The same fate likely awaits another group descended from 19th century immigrants, the Czech Texans. Their story mirrors the Texas Germans at first, with a large immigrant community in Texas speaking this European language. But there wasn't ever any anti-Czech sentiment which spelled the doom of Texas Czech. Rather, simple demographics did that. Unlike the Texas Germans, there was not enough Czechs to settle an entire region, and they were dispersed in smaller numbers. Their culture was still impactful, with Czech celebrations and food being commonplace in some areas. But of the nearly 200,000 people descended from these immigrants, only about 12,000 actually speak Czech anymore, most of them being older people. And believe it or not, Czech isn't the only Slavic language with a community in Texas. Texas Silesian, just like Texas German and Texas Czech, was brought over by Silesian immigrants in the mid-19th century. If you're unaware of who the Silesians are, they are people who reside in Silesia, located here. Silesia was on the border between Germanic-speaking Europe and Slavic-speaking Europe, and as such, the region was thoroughly populated by German speakers, with the Silesians actually being the minority in many areas of Silesia. Silesian is closely related to Polish, and today all of Silesia is part of Poland. Texas Silesian, like most languages in North America, is a more archaic form of Silesian, seeming almost like a snapshot from 1850s Silesia. This is true of most every language we've talked about so far, but it's especially worth mentioning here because Silesian was heavily influenced by German during the Kulturkampf, which was a period of intense Germanization in the German Empire. Because Texas Silesian was brought to the New World before the Kulturkampf, these German influences were absent in Texas Silesian. Silesian culture never had as much impact on Texas as the Germans or even the Czechs had, and their language began to dwindle almost immediately. Like most languages in this video, Texas Silesian began to fade due to it not being taught in schools and not being the dominant language in its given region. Today, there are less than 100 speakers of Texas Silesian left, and it will likely die out during our lifetimes. This next language is more of an honorable mention than anything. For years, I've always heard people talk about the population of Scots and Scottish Gaelic speakers in the Appalachian Mountains, which supposedly persisted until the late 1800s. Upon doing some research into this, I really couldn't find any evidence of this at all. Just some people who said it was true, and some people who said it was false. Now, it's true there was a lot of immigration to this region by people from Scotland and Northern Ireland, so it's likely there were some individuals or families who lived there that spoke these languages. But there is no evidence that it was ever widespread or there were ever communities that spoke it. Maybe there were some, but if so, they've been lost to the sands of time. If you have any information about this, please leave a comment, because there's not much on this topic at all. With that out of the way, this brings us to the last language of this video. Up to now, we focused on mainly European languages, but this one is a little different. On the Atlantic coast of Georgia and the Carolinas, Gullah has been spoken by the local black population for generations. Gullah is a Creole language, spoken exclusively by a select population of African Americans in this area. Remember, a Creole language is a language of mixed origins, which comes about when groups of people with different languages are forced to communicate with each other. Similar to Louisiana Creole, Gullah was formed when African slaves, who spoke several different languages, had to communicate with their masters and one another, learning an imperfect form of English, with lots of African vocabulary and grammar still a part of it. The key difference between the two being that Louisiana Creole was based on French, while Gullah was based on English. This language persisted among the slaves and later free blacks on the coast and the nearby islands for centuries, but it slowly began to fade over the years. Gullah was largely what the slaves spoke amongst each other, with them usually speaking standard English when communicating with whites. This continued to be the case even after emancipation, and so English, which isn't that different from Gullah, gradually began to replace it. Today, there are about 5,000 people who can speak it, but only 300 actually speak it natively. While most people have probably never heard of Gullah, they almost certainly have been exposed to it via the song Kumbaya, which is likely of Gullah origin. Kumbaya is actually a Gullah phrase meaning come by here, which you can kind of see once it's pointed out. In recent years, many Gullah speakers have embraced their language as a point of pride, and it has experienced a bit of a revival. With some luck, Gullah may just survive. As you've no doubt seen throughout this video, the history of language in America is one of assimilation and homogenization. Initially, several different languages were spoken in the various colonies, and more languages were brought in by immigration. Over time, these languages began to disappear, replaced by the majority language and lingua franca of English. This highlights that America isn't truly a nation, and is instead an empire that takes in and assimilates countless different peoples, languages, and cultures into a single whole. This has long been America's great strength, that they could pull foreign manpower and talent from anywhere and transform it into American manpower and talent in just a couple generations. Whether this is good or bad, I'll leave for you to be the judge. With that, we're wrapped up for today. This is not a comprehensive list, though I did hit most of the major minority languages in the US. If you would like to see a part 2, leave a comment and I just might do it.